The company 0x4447 builds products to increase standardization and security in AWS organizations. And they do this with automated pipelines that use well-structured projects to create secure, easy to maintain, and fail-tolerant solutions. One of those is their VPN product, built on top of the popular OpenVPN project, which has no license restrictions. You're only limited by the network card in the instance. To learn more, visit snark.cloud/deploy-and-go. That's snark.cloud/deploy-and-go, all one word. Our newest principal cloud economist, Alex Rasmussen, hails from a data engineering background. This is a capability that we and our consulting clients have increasingly needed, but his experience means that he's been focused on different specific areas of the AWS universe than we have. As a result, he's had some great questions for us as he's been going through his onboarding that folks with a more mainstream SRE background have previously taken for granted. One that caught my eye was around getting access to our internal AWS accounts. Specifically, he said, "This is a very different and remarkably polished way of getting access to accounts. Is that an artifact of something internal that we've done, or is there something else going on?" A quick back and forth later established that he was used to what many folks were, in the sense of a traditional granting of access to AWS accounts. Here's your username and password, here's your IAM credentials, at first login it's going to yell at you to change your password and set up MFA, is the best case for this process. Often the IAM policies bound to the user's account don't permit self-management of MFA devices. The password isn't set to automatically demand a refresh at first login, so the credentials that were shared become permanent, and so on. If you've been around the AWS block a bit, this is no surprise to you. In fact, it's a rather depressing dance we all go through. For internal accounts, we instead have been using AWS SSO, or single sign-on, almost by accident for a while now, just because it came along for the ride when I used AWS Control Tower to provision our AWS organization's account structure. Like many great AWS services, you'd think it was covered by NDA based upon how little Amazonians talk about it in public. Now, there are great reasons to adopt SSO, and I do endorse the pattern. First, it keeps us from having to have persistent credentials on disk. The ephemeral credentials that SSO provides to us are only valid for the duration of the session. They're not going to be hanging out in your AWS credentials file for anything overly nosy to snoop into. Further, the login flow is pretty great. To sign into the start of the day, we go to an account-wide URL which demands a username, a password, and optionally a demand for an MFA key press or token. Unlike IAM users, multiple MFA devices are supported, and there's an option to trust the browser you're using so you aren't asked to re-authenticate via MFA every time you log in. Unlike role chaining IAM roles, we aren't limited to an hour per session. Instead, the default timeout, both in browser and for ephemeral credentials in the CLI, is 12 hours. In effect, this grants us login once a day levels of convenience instead of, "It's been an hour, surprise, your command just failed, headaches." Now, there are some areas for improvement. Regardless of whether or not you use MFA to log in, your session lacks the multi-factor auth present attribute. Therefore, any role assumption or other IAM restrictions that require it will not permit the SSO user to perform the requested action. This episode is sponsored in part by our friends at Vultr, spelled VULTR, because they're all about helping save money, including on things like, vowels. So what they do is they are a cloud provider that provides surprisingly high performance cloud compute at a price that, well, sure, they claim it is better than AWS's pricing, and when they say that, they mean that it's less money. Sure, I don't dispute that, but what I find interesting is that it's predictable. They tell you in advance on a monthly basis what it's going to cost. They have a bunch of advanced networking features. They have 19 global locations and scale things elastically, not to be confused with openly, which is apparently elastic and open. They can mean the same thing sometimes. They have had over 1 million users. Deployments take less than 60 seconds across 12 pre-selected operating systems. Or if you're one of those nutters like me, you can bring your own ISO and install basically any operating system you want. Starting with pricing as low as $2.50 a month for Vultr Cloud Compute, they have plans for developers and businesses of all sizes, except maybe Amazon, who stubbornly insists on having something of the scale on their own. Try Vultr today for free by visiting vultr.com/screaming, and you'll receive $100 in credit. That's vultr.com/screaming. Also, IAM is global while SSO is single region. If it's impacted in that region, guess who can't log into their AWS account? That's right, your entire company. And of course, in its effort to remain on brand for AWS, the user experience is subpar for using it day to day. That said, there are some tooling options that exist to make it better. Ben Kehoe has created AWS SSO Util, a utility that's intentionally designed to be a thin layer on top of AWS's offering so as not to diverge from the AWS service vision as it continues to evolve. Despite the noble intention, Ben misses the mark here. To truly remain aligned with AWS's user experience, this tool would instead require you to type the full access key, secret key, and session token into your terminal by hand after disabling your ability to copy and paste. Aaron Turner has created AWS SSO CLI, an opinionated CLI helper that offers tab completion, the ability to launch shells with the proper environment variables set, and a much more polished experience. It even supports multiple SSO organizations for those of us who do unholy things with our AWS accounts. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that AWS Vault didn't also support AWS SSO super well once you've configured the relevant profile within your AWS config file. I really like AWS SSO. I wish that I didn't have to work with IAM credentials as well and could migrate everything over to using it. As it stands, my options today are to use both methods for different things, dream of a better world, and try mightily to resist the temptation to build some obscene portal that lets SSO users access vended IAM MFA credentials as needed to assume roles where they're required. As for Alex, he's almost certainly very sorry that he asked the question.
This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.